What made 6 Australian soldiers more terrifying than an entire United States Army battalion? The war that defined a generation and changed the face of modern warfare forever. American forces brought the most powerful military machine on Earth to bear against an enemy that moved like smoke through triple canopy jungle. The Americans came with overwhelming firepower that could level entire grid squares in minutes, with helicopter gunships that turned night into day, with artillery barrages that shook the earth, and B-52 strikes that could be felt from miles away. They moved in battalions of hundreds of soldiers, supported by armor and air power and unlimited ammunition and the technological superiority that the free world could muster. And despite all of this firepower, and all of this technology, and all of these resources, they struggled to bring the enemy to decisive battle. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had mastered something far more valuable than firepower in the context of jungle warfare, and that was the ability to become invisible in terrain they knew like the back of their hands. They could hear American units approaching from 200 meters away through dense jungle, equipment clanking against metal, radio operators speaking coordinates, the distinctive sound of American boots on hard-packed trails. The jungle itself became an early warning system that announced American movements long before contact was ever made. The VC would strike with devastating surprise and then melt back into the vegetation like they had never existed at all, leaving behind chaos and casualties and questions. This was a war of ghosts versus giants, where technological superiority meant nothing if you couldn't find your enemy. But there was another force operating in Vietnam that most people have never heard about. Smaller than American units, quieter than anything the Viet Cong had encountered before, more deadly per man than any force in theater. Australian soldiers, not massive battalions sweeping through free fire zones, not company-sized operations supported by artillery and airstrikes. Patrols of just 6 men moving through enemy-controlled territory for weeks at a time. And the Viet Cong, who feared nothing else in this war, feared them above all others. This is the story of why 6 Australian soldiers were more terrifying to the enemy than an entire American battalion, and how they achieved the impossible in the most hostile jungle environment on Earth. To understand what happened in the jungles of Vietnam, we need to go back in time to another war in another jungle where Australians learned lessons that would make them the most feared soldiers in Southeast Asia. The year is 1948 and the place is Malaya, which is now modern-day Malaysia. Communist insurgents backed by international support were waging a guerrilla war against British colonial forces and their allies in terrain that was almost identical to what would later be encountered in Vietnam. Dense triple canopy jungle where visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers. Oppressive heat and humidity that could break the strongest men. Torrential monsoon rains that turned the ground into swamp. An enemy that knew every trail and every river crossing and every cave system. An enemy that could disappear into villages and blend with the local population. An enemy that didn't wear uniforms and didn't fight conventional battles and didn't offer targets for artillery or air power. This was counterinsurgency warfare at its most brutal and most demanding, and the Australians who deployed to Malaya learned hard lessons that would be paid for in blood and sweat over 12 long years from 1948 to 1960. They learned how to track enemy movement through jungle by reading signs that were invisible to untrained eyes. They learned silent movement techniques that allowed them to pass within meters of enemy positions without being detected. They learned ambush tactics that could neutralize numerically superior forces through perfect positioning and fire discipline. They learned how to live in the jungle for extended periods, surviving on minimal rations and functioning in conditions that would break conventional soldiers. They learned how to read enemy patterns and behavior and predict where insurgents would move and when they would strike. They learned counterinsurgency operations that focused on controlling population and cutting off enemy support, rather than just achieving body counts. By the time the Malayan Emergency ended in 1960, with a decisive victory for Commonwealth forces, the Australians had accumulated over a decade of institutional knowledge about jungle warfare and counterinsurgency that was unmatched anywhere in the world. When Australian forces began deploying to Vietnam in 1962, they brought with them 15 years of hard-won jungle warfare experience that had been refined in actual combat against an enemy that used identical tactics to the Viet Cong. The Americans, in contrast, were coming from Korea, where they had fought a conventional war with clear front lines and massive artillery support, and from training focused on potential conflict in Europe against Soviet armored divisions. The Americans had World War II veterans with experience in the Pacific, but that was conventional warfare island hopping with naval and air support, not prolonged jungle counterinsurgency. The Australians had something no amount of firepower could replace, and that was knowledge of how to fight and win in exactly this kind of environment, against exactly this kind of enemy. Every single Australian soldier who deployed to Vietnam had to pass through one place before they ever set foot in country, and that place was the Canungra Jungle Warfare Training Center, located in the rainforests of Queensland. This wasn't optional training or a brief orientation course. This was mandatory, intensive preparation in realistic jungle conditions that separated those who would survive in Vietnam from those who would become casualties. Canungra was built in some of the most challenging terrain Australia had to offer, with dense vegetation and steep ridges and conditions that closely approximated what soldiers would face in Southeast Asia. The training was brutally realistic and unforgiving in its standards. Silent movement techniques were drilled until they became second nature, until every Australian soldier understood that noise in the jungle meant death. Tracking and counter-tracking skills were taught by instructors who had survived Malaya and knew exactly what worked and what got you killed. Ambush tactics were practiced until the positioning and fire discipline, withdrawal procedures were automatic under stress. Jungle survival skills covered everything from water procurement to navigation without trails, to functioning in monsoon conditions for extended periods. Navigation techniques focused on moving through terrain without using obvious features like trails or ridges that the enemy would be watching and ambushing. Live fire exercises in dense vegetation taught soldiers how to engage targets at jungle ranges where visibility was measured in meters and speed of reaction meant everything. The Americans had no equivalent to Canungra. There was no mandatory jungle warfare school that every Vietnam-bound soldier had to pass through. Some American units received jungle training, and special forces certainly had advanced instruction, but for the vast majority of American infantry heading to Vietnam, their first real jungle experience came after they arrived in country. By then it was too late to build the instinctive skills that kept you alive. The Americans would learn through hard experience and high casualties. The Australians arrived already, knowing how to fight this war, because they had fought it before and won. Now picture this scene in your mind, because it illustrates the difference between Australian and American operations better than any statistics ever could. A jungle trail in Phuoc Tuy province, which was the main area of Australian operations in South Vietnam. The year is 1967. Dawn mist still clings to the undergrowth and visibility is limited to perhaps 50 meters in the dense vegetation. An American patrol of 30 men is moving down this trail in standard tactical formation. From 200 meters away, you can hear them approaching. The distinctive sound of equipment that no amount of careful packing can completely silence. The occasional voice as someone calls out a halt or points out an obstacle. The sound of boots on earth that has been packed down by previous use. The rhythmic pattern of movement that the human ear picks up even through dense jungle. The Viet Cong positioned in ambush positions along this trail hear the Americans coming long before visual contact is made. They have time to prepare and position and coordinate their fire. They wait until the American column is fully committed to the kill zone, and then they trigger the ambush with devastating effect. RPGs and AK-47 fire and grenades detonate simultaneously, creating chaos in the American formation. The Americans fight back with tremendous courage and call in artillery support and helicopter gunships and medevac for their wounded, but the damage is done and the VC fade back into the jungle before the full weight of American firepower be brought to bear. Now picture the same trail the following night. 6 Australian SAS soldiers are operating in this area on a 10-day deep penetration patrol. You don't hear them approaching because they're not using the trail at all. They're moving through the jungle itself parallel to the trail, but far enough off to avoid any ambush positions. Their movement is incredibly slow and deliberate, covering perhaps a kilometer in several hours. Every piece of equipment has been taped down or secured to eliminate noise. They communicate through hand signals only, with no verbal communication whatsoever. No one is smoking because the smell of cigarette smoke can be detected for hundreds of meters downwind. They move during hours when the enemy expects no movement, using darkness and rain as concealment. Their camouflage is natural vegetation gathered from the immediate area that breaks up their outline and blends with the surroundings. They pass within arm's reach of a Viet Cong observation post that has been set up to watch the trail. The VC sentries see nothing and hear nothing because the Australians have become part of the jungle itself, moving like shadows through terrain they have learned to read and use. The Australians continue their patrol, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and base camp locations and supply routes that will be used to plan future operations. The Viet Cong never knew they were there. This happened hundreds of times during the Australian deployment to Vietnam, and it's why the enemy gave them a name that would become legendary: Ma Rung. Phantoms of the jungle, ghosts that appeared without warning and vanished without trace. The difference between Australian and American operations went far deeper than just movement techniques or noise discipline. It was a fundamental difference in tactical philosophy about how to fight this kind of war. The Americans employed what was called search and destroy tactics, which were based on using large unit operations to find the enemy and then destroying them with overwhelming firepower. American battalions and companies would sweep through areas trying to make contact with enemy forces. When contact was made, the immediate response was to fix the enemy in place and call in massive fire support from artillery and helicopter gunships and tactical airstrikes. Success was measured primarily through body count, which became the controversial metric that drove American strategy throughout the war. The American approach was reactive in nature, waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves through contact and then responding with the full weight of American firepower. Americans used established trails and landing zones because moving large units through virgin jungle was logistically difficult and time-consuming. This created predictable patterns that the Viet Cong learned to exploit through well-planned ambushes. The Australian approach was completely different and based on lessons learned during the Malayan Emergency about how to fight guerrilla forces in jungle terrain. Australian operations used small patrol tactics with teams of just 5 to 6 men that could move silently through any terrain. These patrols conducted constant aggressive patrolling throughout their assigned areas, maintaining pressure on enemy forces and denying them freedom of movement. When Australians made contact with enemy forces, the engagement was usually on Australian terms because they had detected the enemy first and positioned for ambush. The Australians pursued enemy forces after contact, attempting to track them back to base camps and supply caches rather than just inflicting casualties and withdrawing. The Australian approach was proactive, seeking out the enemy rather than waiting to be attacked, and using stealth and surprise rather than firepower as the primary weapon. Australians deliberately avoided trails and obvious terrain features, moving through the jungle itself on routes that were unpredictable and couldn't be easily ambushed. Noise discipline and light discipline were absolutely enforced at all times, with violations being career-ending offenses. Australian patrols could maintain ambush positions for days at a time, with men remaining motionless in position, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Australian method was based on thinking like the enemy and using the same guerrilla tactics that the Viet Cong employed against American forces. They ambushed the ambushers. They controlled ground through constant presence, rather than occasional operations in force. They made the enemy afraid to move freely in areas where Australian patrols operated. This fundamental difference in philosophy produced dramatically different results, as the statistics would later prove. Let's talk about numbers, because the statistics from Australian operations in Vietnam tell a story that many people find hard to believe. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, which was the elite special operations force deployed to Vietnam, conducted 1,200 combat patrols over 7 years of operations from 1966 to 1971. Of those 1,200 patrols deep behind enemy lines, in some of the most hostile terrain in Vietnam, the SASR suffered 1 killed in action and 1 dead from wounds and 3 accidental deaths. The kill ratio achieved by Australian SAS patrols was approximately 500 enemy casualties for every Australian SAS soldier lost in combat. Some specific operations achieved ratios as high as 100 to 1 or even 164 to 1, depending on the engagement. Compare this to American forces, who on average expended approximately 200,000 rounds of small arms ammunition for every enemy soldier killed. The Australian figures represent a level of efficiency and lethality per man that was unmatched by any other force operating in Vietnam, including American Special Forces. Total Australian casualties over the entire war from 1962 to 1973, with 60,000 personnel deployed, were 521 killed and 2,400 wounded. While every casualty represents tragedy for families and units, these figures were proportionally lower than American and South Vietnamese casualties, despite Australians fighting the same enemy in similar terrain. Why such a dramatic difference in effectiveness? The answer lies in training and tactics and philosophy. Every round fired by an Australian patrol was an aimed shot at a specific target rather than suppressive fire. Australian patrols operated in small numbers of 6 men, which meant they could move silently and position perfectly before initiating contact. When Australians engaged enemy forces, it was almost always from ambush positions, where they held every advantage of surprise and positioning and fields of fire. Australian patrols would spend days tracking and observing enemy movements before deciding when and where to strike for maximum effect. The emphasis was always on quality over quantity, with each patrol member being a highly trained specialist rather than strength through numbers. These weren't just soldiers. These were hunters who had mastered their environment and their craft to a degree that made them devastating opponents despite their small numbers. Let me walk you through a typical Australian SAS patrol to show you exactly how they operated and why the Viet Cong feared them so much. The location is Phuoc Tuy Province near the village of Long Tan in July 1967. A 6-man Australian SAS patrol has been tasked with conducting a 10-day long-range reconnaissance mission in an area where intelligence suggests significant enemy activity. The patrol consists of a patrol commander, who is a veteran of both Malaya and a previous Vietnam tour, a scout, who is the best tracker in the squadron, with an almost supernatural ability to read sign in jungle terrain, a signaller who carries the radio but operates under strict instructions to maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary for emergency extraction, 3 riflemen who are all cross-trained in multiple skills and can fill any role in the patrol. Day 1 begins with a helicopter insertion approximately 15 kilometers from their actual patrol area. This is deliberate deception, because the Australians know the enemy watches helicopter movements and will investigate insertion points. After the helicopter departs, the patrol waits in complete silence for 2 full hours, not moving and barely breathing, listening to the jungle and making absolutely certain no enemy forces are tracking toward the insertion point. Only after this security halt do they begin moving, and their movement is toward a completely different direction from their actual objective. Day 2 through 4 involve incredibly slow movement through triple canopy jungle, completely off any trails or obvious terrain features. They navigate by terrain association and dead reckoning and compass bearings, with no GPS or satellite navigation to help them. Progress is measured in meters per hour, not kilometers, because moving silently through dense undergrowth while maintaining security is exhausting and time-consuming. They see signs of enemy activity all around them, including boot prints in soft earth, and a discarded ammunition crate and fresh machete cuts on bamboo where someone has cut a trail. The patrol is close to enemy forces but remains undetected because of their movement discipline. Day 5 at 4 in the morning before dawn, the scout signals for the patrol to halt using only hand signals. He has found something, and the patrol goes to ground immediately, with each man finding concealment in the thick undergrowth. What the scout has found is a well-used trail showing recent foot traffic, and the patrol commander makes the decision to set up an observation post. They move 30 meters off the trail into vegetation so thick you could walk past them at 5 meters and never know they were there, and they settle in to wait and observe. Day 6 at 4 in the afternoon, after over 30 hours in position barely moving except to drink water and relieve themselves 1 man at a time, movement is detected on the trail. A Viet Cong company of between 60 and 80 men is moving along the trail armed with AK-47 assault rifles and RPG rocket launchers and light machine guns. The enemy soldiers are relaxed, talking among themselves, and smoking and moving with the confidence of men who believe they own this jungle. the Australian patrol commander makes a tactical decision. Standard operating procedure would be to observe and report and avoid contact because they're outnumbered more than 12 to 1. But the commander sees something significant. The VC are carrying heavy packs loaded with ammunition and supplies, and this isn't just a patrol, this is a supply column heading toward a base camp. He decides to initiate an ambush. The patrol repositions carefully over the next 20 minutes, moving 40 meters from the trail into perfect ambush positions with overlapping fields of fire covering a kill zone. The patrol commander designates targets to each man using hand signals. He will take the lead element. The scout will take the rear security element. The other 4 will engage targets in the center of the formation. Each man has a specific firing lane with no overlap to maximize efficiency. Every Australian soldier has his safety off and finger on trigger and is controlling his breathing, waiting for the signal. The VC column enters the kill zone, still completely unaware of the Australian presence. The patrol commander's L1A1 rifle cracks once and the point man drops instantly. The scout's rifle fires and the rear security drops. The middle of the formation erupts with precisely aimed fire that drops targets with almost every shot. 7 seconds of controlled fire and 15 Viet Cong soldiers are down. The enemy formation disintegrates into chaos, with men diving for cover and returning fire wildly into the jungle. But they don't know where the Australians are, because there was no muzzle flash visible in the shadows and no sustained fire to give away positions. The patrol commander signals to withdraw, and the 6 Australians melt back into the jungle, moving 60 meters, then 100 meters, then 200 meters from the ambush site. They can still hear the VC shouting and firing into empty jungle at targets that no longer exist. By the time the enemy organizes any kind of pursuit, the Australians have vanished completely, leaving no trail to follow. Day 7 through 9, the patrol continues their mission, moving through the area and gathering intelligence on enemy base camps and supply routes and defensive positions. They have made contact and inflicted significant casualties, but their mission continues because intelligence gathering is just as important as body count. Day 10, the patrol moves to their extraction point and is lifted out by helicopter, having completed their mission successfully. They return with detailed intelligence that will be used to plan future operations. Not a single Australian was wounded during this entire mission. This scenario played out hundreds of times during the Australian deployment to Vietnam. This is why 1,200 patrols resulted in such devastating effectiveness against enemy forces. Because you can't ambush what you can't hear, and you can't fight what you can't see, and you can't pursue ghosts that leave no trail. But the reputation of Australian forces in Vietnam wasn't built solely on stealth operations and small patrol tactics. Sometimes circumstances forced them into conventional battles where they had to stand and fight against overwhelming odds, and these battles proved that Australian soldiers were just as formidable in defensive operations as they were in offensive patrolling. The Battle of Long Tan, which occurred on August 18, 1966, remains the most famous Australian engagement of the Vietnam War, and it's a story that deserves to be told in detail because it shows the character and capability of Australian forces under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The night before, on August 17, Viet Cong forces had bombarded the Australian base at Nui Dat with mortars and recoilless rifles, firing over 100 rounds into the compound. At dawn on August 18, D Company from the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was ordered to patrol into the Long Tan rubber plantation to locate the enemy firing positions and track the direction of their withdrawal after the attack. D Company consisted of 108 Australian soldiers plus 3 New Zealand artillery forward observers who would prove absolutely critical to the battle's outcome. By early afternoon, the company had entered the Long Tan plantation, which consisted of rows of rubber trees that limited visibility to perhaps 50 meters in any direction. A monsoon storm was rolling in, bringing torrential rain and thunder that would mask sound and reduce visibility even further. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, D Company made contact with what they initially thought was a small enemy patrol, but this assessment was wrong in ways that would soon become terrifyingly clear. What D Company had encountered was not a patrol or even a company, but an entire enemy regiment forming up for a major attack on the Australian base. Estimates of enemy strength vary between 1,500 and 2,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars from the 275th Regiment, reinforced by D. 445 Battalion, with the specific mission of overrunning Nui Dat and destroying the Australian presence in Phuoc Tuy province. The Australians were outnumbered by a factor of at least 15 to 1, and possibly as high as 20 to 1. Major Harry Smith, who commanded D Company, immediately recognized the extreme danger his force was in and radioed for artillery support. The 3 New Zealand forward observers, Captain Maurice Stanley and his team, began calling in fire missions with precision that would save the Australian force from annihilation. The Viet Cong attacked in waves, using human wave assault tactics with dozens and then hundreds of soldiers attempting to overwhelm the Australian defensive perimeter through sheer numbers. The monsoon rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, making movement difficult and reducing visibility to just meters. Thunder and artillery explosions merged into continuous deafening noise that made command and control almost impossible. D Company formed a defensive perimeter with their 3 platoons arranged in a rough triangular formation. Every man counted because there were no reserves and no one to spare. Ammunition began running critically low, with some soldiers down to their last magazines. The fighting was desperate and close range, with enemy soldiers getting within meters of Australian positions before being driven back. The New Zealand artillery observers continued calling in fire missions with devastating accuracy, dropping high explosive shells within 100 meters of friendly positions, which is danger close by any standard. Australian soldiers held their fire discipline even under extreme stress, taking aimed shots rather than spraying bullets wildly into the rain. The VC continued attacking wave after wave, expecting to break through Australian lines through sheer pressure of numbers, but the Australians refused to break. After 3 hours of continuous combat, with ammunition nearly exhausted and casualties mounting, reinforcements finally arrived. A relief force of armored personnel carriers, loaded with ammunition and fresh infantry, broke through enemy lines to reach D Company's position. The arrival of the APCs with their heavy machine guns and the resupply of ammunition turned the tide of battle. The Viet Cong forces withdrew into the jungle, having failed to overrun the Australian position despite overwhelming numerical superiority. When dawn broke the next day, and the battlefield could be properly assessed, the scope of what had happened became clear. Australian casualties were 18 killed and 24 wounded, which was tragic but far lower than what should have resulted from such an engagement. Enemy casualties were far higher, with Australian claims of 245 confirmed killed and 350 wounded, though Vietnamese sources claimed only 47 killed, which is almost certainly a significant undercount. The strategic impact of Long Tan was immense because it prevented a major attack on Nui Dat and demonstrated to the Viet Cong that Australian forces would not break or retreat even when facing impossible odds. For months afterward, enemy forces avoided the areas around Long Tan, having learned that attacking Australian positions was a high-risk operation that would result in heavy casualties. The battle showcased Australian discipline under fire and brilliant artillery coordination, and the refusal to panic even when surrounded and outnumbered. Veterans of Long Tan would say afterward that they survived because of their training and because of mutual trust in their mates, and because retreat was simply not something they considered, even when the rational choice might have been to withdraw. The psychological impact of Australian operations on Viet Cong forces was profound, and this psychological warfare aspect is often overlooked in discussions of Vietnam tactics. Large American units, despite their firepower, were predictable. The VC could track American helicopter movements and supply convoys and patterns of operation. They knew where American firebases were located, and which units operated in which areas, and how those units would respond to contact. American operations followed patterns that could be studied and exploited through careful observation. But 6 Australian soldiers could be anywhere at any time, operating in areas that should have been completely enemy-controlled. A VC company moving through terrain they considered safe would suddenly come under devastating fire from positions they never detected. Supply columns would be ambushed on trails that had been used safely for months. Base camps that should have been secure would be discovered and reported, leading to airstrikes or larger operations. The Viet Cong couldn't predict Australian movements because Australian patrols didn't follow predictable patterns or use the same routes or operate on regular schedules. Every rustle in the jungle at night could potentially be an Australian patrol setting up an ambush. Every trail could potentially be under observation by invisible watchers who would call in artillery fire. This created paranoia among enemy forces who never knew when they might be under surveillance or about to be engaged. The psychological effect of being hunted, rather than being the hunter, was profound. Viet Cong forces were used to operating with relative freedom in their controlled areas and setting up ambushes on their terms against American forces they could hear coming. Against Australian patrols, they lost that advantage completely and found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being prey rather than predator. Captured Vietnamese documents and post-war interviews with former VC officers revealed the extent of this fear. Standing orders were issued to VC units to withdraw immediately if they encountered Australian forces and to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Areas patrolled by Australians saw reduced enemy activity as VC units shifted their operations to locations where they faced less capable opposition. After major battles like Long Tan, VC commanders admitted in internal reports that Australian tactics and fire discipline were superior to American approaches, and that casualties from engagements with Australians were disproportionately high. Vietnamese officers interviewed after the war specifically mentioned the SASR and the Royal Australian Regiment as the only forces they genuinely feared, in the same way they were taught to fear nothing else. The psychological impact of small, highly trained forces operating with complete stealth was far greater than the impact of large conventional forces, because fear of the unknown is more powerful than fear of known threats. After the war ended and veterans from both sides had time to reflect, captured testimonies and interviews revealed the enemy perspective on fighting Australian forces, and these testimonies are remarkable for their candor and respect. Former Viet Cong officers, when asked about different Allied forces they fought against, consistently ranked Australian forces as the most dangerous and most feared opponents. One former VC commander stated that standing orders in his unit were to withdraw if you encounter Australians, because engagement was considered high risk with low probability of success. Another Vietnamese officer commented that Australians moved like us, meaning they used guerrilla tactics and jungle craft that matched or exceeded VC capabilities, making them impossible to ambush effectively. A former NVA officer observed that Australians were more aggressive than Americans, in that they patrolled off trails and through terrain that Americans avoided, making traditional ambush tactics ineffective. Perhaps most tellingly, multiple Vietnamese sources from interviews and captured documents referred to Australian SASR and RAR units as the only troops we genuinely feared, with a level of respect that was not extended to other Allied forces. The Vietnamese acknowledged that they couldn't hear Australian patrols approaching, which removed their primary defensive advantage in jungle terrain. They noted that Australian soldiers showed better fire discipline and marksmanship than American forces, engaging targets with aimed fire rather than suppressive fire. They recognized that Australian tactics focused on long-term control of territory through constant presence rather than temporary sweeps that they could wait out. The enemy perspective is important because it validates what the statistics already showed, which was that Australian methods of jungle warfare were uniquely effective against guerrilla forces in this environment. The Viet Cong and NVA were not weak opponents. They defeated the French. They fought the Americans to a stalemate, despite massive disadvantages in firepower and technology. They were tough, experienced jungle fighters who knew their terrain and were absolutely committed to their cause. And yet these hardened veterans consistently identified Australian forces as their most dangerous opponents, not because of firepower or numbers, but because of tactics and training, and the psychological pressure of facing an enemy they couldn't predict or detect until it was too late. The legacy of Australian forces in Vietnam extends far beyond the war itself and continues to influence military doctrine and special operations training to this day. The tactics and techniques developed and refined by Australian forces in Malaya and perfected in Vietnam became the foundation for modern counterinsurgency doctrine used by special operations forces worldwide. Silent movement techniques and patrol procedures and ambush tactics pioneered by Australian SAS are now standard training for elite units across multiple nations. The emphasis on small team operations and stealth over firepower and quality over quantity became the model for special operations forces in conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq to current operations. The Australian approach to counterinsurgency, which focused on long-term presence and population control and denying enemy freedom of movement rather than just achieving body counts, proved to be the correct strategy, even though it wasn't fully adopted by American forces until much later. Military historians studying the Vietnam War consistently point to Australian operations as examples of how to effectively fight guerrilla forces in jungle terrain, with multiple doctrine publications and training programs using Australian tactics as case studies. The Canungra training model of mandatory realistic jungle warfare training for all deploying personnel has been adopted in various forms by multiple nations who recognized its value. The kill ratios and operational effectiveness achieved by Australian forces, especially the SASR, set benchmarks that modern special operations forces study and attempt to emulate. Perhaps most importantly, the Australian experience proved that in counterinsurgency warfare training and tactics and understanding of terrain and enemy are far more important than technological superiority or numerical advantage. You cannot win a guerrilla war through firepower alone. You win by being better at guerrilla tactics than the guerrillas themselves. You win by making the enemy afraid to operate freely in areas they once controlled. You win by being patient and professional and disciplined enough to operate in small numbers in hostile territory for extended periods. The Australian forces in Vietnam proved all of these principles through their actions, and their results speak for themselves. In the end, the story of why 6 Australian soldiers were more feared than an entire American battalion comes down to fundamentals that have nothing to do with patriotism or equipment or firepower. It comes down to training and tactics and mindset. The Australians trained harder specifically for jungle warfare through mandatory preparation at Canungra that built skills and instincts that kept men alive. They learned from previous experience in Malaya, giving them 15 years of institutional knowledge about fighting this exact kind of war in this exact kind of terrain. They employed tactics suited to the environment using small patrols and stealth and patience rather than trying to apply conventional warfare doctrine to an unconventional conflict. They developed a hunter's mindset that focused on understanding and predicting enemy behavior rather than just finding and destroying targets through firepower. They maintained discipline in all aspects of operations, from noise and light discipline to fire discipline to mission discipline, that made them devastatingly effective. The numbers tell the story better than words ever could. 1,200 patrols, 500 to 1 kill ratio, 1 killed in action. These weren't just good soldiers. These were masters of their craft, operating at a level that made them legendary among those who fought beside them and feared by those who fought against them. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, not as an insult, but as a recognition of reality. They were phantoms who appeared without warning and disappeared without trace, and killed with precision that defied their small numbers. In a war where technological superiority and massive firepower failed to achieve victory, 6 men with rifles and superior training and jungle craft proved to be the most effective weapon of all. That's why the Viet Cong feared them. That's why their legend endures. And that's why their story deserves to be remembered and studied by every soldier who might face similar challenges in the future. If you found this story of Australian forces in Vietnam compelling, then subscribe for more in-depth military history documentaries covering elite units, covert operations, and untold stories from conflicts around the world.